Welcome back, at long last, to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator host, Fragath. Today we're going to be reading a long short story by the name of Riding the Crocodile by Greg Egan from the short story collection by Greg Egan called Oceanic. Give me one sec here. Yeah, it's a long friggin' story. Jeez Louise. Okay. Alrighty. I just need to mark out where the next long short story is. There's going to be at least two more. Oh, at least two more streams. Actually, it should just be two more, which includes the short story Hot Rock, and after that, the short story, the titular short story Oceanic. But we're not doing those today. We're doing the longer short story, uh, Riding the Crocodile. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. Bookmark right there. Okay. So yeah, this is about relationships, long-term commitments. It's also about communication. It's about other things too. Those are big parts of it. Anyway, let's get cracking. Because I'm starting later than I wanted to. I wanted actually to start like half an hour early because I got a lot of stuff I got to get done today. But by hook or by crook, we will be getting through this short story. I will make it happen. Um, like my weekend is tumultuous, which is hilarious because it's the exact opposite of how it's supposed to be. This is not this this is not how things got planned out. In fact, I planned to ensure that it would not be a busy Thanksgiving year this year, and it's turning into one. Except I didn't get to have any damn turkey. Roar! Um, which is why I'm a little on edge. I kid, of course. Disadvantage of being free um, means other people are like, "Oh, can you help with?" And it's like, "Yes, okay, fine." Anyway, give me a sec here. Riding the Crocodile by Greg Egan. 1. In their 10,309th year of marriage, Layla and Yasim began contemplating death. They had known love, raised children, and witnessed the flourishing generations of their offspring. They had traveled to a dozen worlds and lived among 1,000 cultures. They had educated themselves many times over, proved theorems, and acquired and abandoned artistic sensibilities and skills. They had not lived in every conceivable manner, far from it, but what room would there be for the multitude if each individual tried to exhaust the permutations of existence? There were some experiences, they agreed, that everyone should try, and others that only a handful of people in all of time need bother with. They had no wish to give up their idiosyncrasies, no wish to uproot their personalities from the niches they had settled in long ago, let alone start cranking mechanically through some tedious enumeration of all the other people they might have been. They had been themselves, and for that they had done, more or less, enough. Before dying, though, they wanted to attempt something grand and audacious. It was not that their lives were incomplete, in need of some final flourish of affirmation. If some unlikely calamity had robbed them of the chance to orchestrate this finale, the closest of their friends would never have remarked upon, let alone mourned, its absence. There was no aesthetic compulsion to be satisfied, no aching existential void to be filled. Nevertheless, it was what they both wanted, and once they had acknowledged this to each other, their hearts were set on it. Choosing the project was not a great burden. That task required nothing but patience. They knew they'd recognize it when it came to them. Every night before sleeping, Jassim would ask Layla, "Did you see it yet?" "No, did you?" "Not yet." Sometimes Layla would dream that she'd found it in her dreams, but the transcripts proved otherwise. Sometimes Jassim felt sure that it was lurking just below the surface of his thoughts, but when he dived down to check, it was nothing but a trick of the light. Years passed. They occupied themselves with simple pleasures: gardening, swimming in the surf, talking with their friends, catching up with their descendants. They had grown skilled at finding pastimes that could bear repetition. Still, were it not for the nameless adventure that awaited them, they would have thrown a pair of dice each evening and agreed that 2 6s would end it all. One night, Layla stood alone in the garden, watching the sky. From their home world, Najib, they had traveled only to the nearest stars with inhabited worlds, each time losing just a few decades to the journey. They had chosen those limits so as not to alienate themselves from friends and family, and it had never felt like much of a constraint. True, the civilization of the Amalgam wrapped the galaxy, and a committed traveler could spend 200,000 years circling back home, but what was to be gained by such an overblown odyssey? The dozen worlds of their neighborhood held enough variety for any traveler, and whether more distant realms were filled with fresh novelties or endless repetition hardly seemed to matter. To have a goal, a destination, would be one thing, but to drown in the sheer plenitude of worlds for its own sake seemed utterly pointless. A destination? Layla overlaid the sky with information, most of it by necessity millennia out of date. There were worlds with spectacular views of nebulas and star clusters, views that could be guaranteed still to be in existence if they traveled to see them, but would taking in such sights firsthand be so much better than immersion in the flawless images already available in Najib's library? To blink away 10,000 years just to wake beneath a cloud of green and violet gas, however lovely, seemed like a terrible anticlimax. The stars tingled with self-aggrandizement, plaintively tugging at her attention. The architecture here, the rivers, the festivals. Even if these tourist attractions could survive the millennia, even if some were literally unique, there was nothing that struck her as a fitting prelude to death. If she and Jassim had formed some whimsical attachment, centuries before, to a world on the other side of the galaxy rumored to hold great beauty or interest, and if they had talked long enough about chasing it down when they had nothing better to do, then keeping that promise might have been worth it, even if the journey led them to a world in ruins. They had no such cherished destination, though, and it was too late to cultivate one now. Layla's gaze followed a thinning in the advertising, taking her to the bulge of stars surrounding the galaxy's center. The disk of the Milky Way belonged to the amalgam, whose various ancestral species had effectively merged into a single civilization, but the central bulge was inhabited by beings who had declined to do so much as communicate with those around them. All attempts to send probes into the bulge, let alone the kind of engineering spores needed to create the infrastructure for travel, had been gently but firmly rebuffed, with the intruders swatted straight back out again. The aloof, with a capital A, had maintained their silence and isolation since before the amalgam itself had even existed. The latest news on this subject was 20,000 years old, but the status quo had held for close to 1,000,000 years. If she and Jassim traveled to the innermost edge of the amalgam's domain, the chances were exceptionally good that the aloof would not have changed their ways in the meantime. In fact, it would be no disappointment at all if the aloof had suddenly thrown open their borders. That unheralded thaw would itself be an extraordinary thing to witness. If the challenge remained, though, all the better. She called Jassim to the garden and pointed out the richness of stars, unadorned with potted histories. "We go where?" he asked.
"As close to the aloof as we're able."
"And do what?"
"Try and observe them," she said. "Try to learn something about them. Try to make contact in whatever way we can."
"You don't think that's been tried before?"
"1,000,000 times. Not so much lately, though. Maybe while the interest on our side has ebbed, they've been changing, growing more receptive."
"Or maybe not." Jassim smiled. He had appeared a little stunned by her proposal at first, but the idea seemed to be growing on him. "It's a hard problem to throw ourselves against, but it's not futile. Not quite." He wrapped her hands in his. "Let's see how we feel in the morning." In the morning, they were both convinced. They would camp at the gates of these elusive strangers and try to rouse them from their indifference. They summoned the family from every corner of Najib. There were some grandchildren and more distant descendants who had settled in other star systems, decades away at light speed, but they chose not to wait to call them home for this final farewell. 200 people crowded the physical house and garden, while 200 more confined themselves to the virtual wing. There was talk and food and music, like any other celebration, and Layla tried to undercut any edge of solemnity that she felt creeping in. As the night wore on, though, each time she kissed a child or grandchild, each time she embraced an old friend, she thought, this could be the last time, ever. There had to be a last time. She couldn't face 10,000 more years. But a part of her spat and struggled like a cornered animal at the thought of each warm touch fading to nothing. As dawn approached, the party shifted entirely into the acorporeal. People took on fancy dress from myth or xenology, or just joked and played with their illusory bodies. It was all very calm and gentle, nothing like the surreal excesses she remembered from her youth, but Layla still felt a tinge of vertigo. When her son Khalid made his ears grow and spin, this amiable silliness carried a hard message. The machinery of the house had ripped her mind from her body as seamlessly as ever, but this time she would never be returning to the same flesh. Sunrise brought the first of the goodbyes. Layla forced herself to release each proffered hand, to unwrap her arms from around each non-existent body. She whispered to Jassim,
"Are you going mad too?"
"Of course." Gradually the crowd thinned out. The wing grew quiet. Layla found herself pacing from room to room, as if she might yet chance upon someone who'd stayed behind. Then she remembered urging the last of them to go, her children and friends tearfully retreating down the hall. She skirted inconsolable sadness, then lifted herself above it and went looking for Jassim. He was waiting for her outside their room. "Are you ready to sleep?" he asked her gently. She said,
"For an eon." 2. Layla woke in the same bed as she'd laid down in. Jassim was still sleeping beside her. The window showed dawn, but it was not the usual view of the cliffs and the ocean. Layla had the house brief her. After 20,000 years, traveling more or less at light speed, pausing only for a microsecond or two at various way stations to be cleaned up and amplified, the package of information bearing the two of them had arrived safely as Nasdeek B. Begain. Begain. Beginning? NAZDEEK hyphen BE hyphen BEEGANE. Nasdeek B. Begain. Begany. I don't know. Begany sounds better. Let's try that sentence from the top. Unfortunately, it's right after a page break. After 20,000 years, traveling more or less at light speed, pausing only for a microsecond or two at various way stations to be cleaned up and amplified, the package of information bearing the two of them had arrived safely at Nasdeek B. Begany. Begany. There we go. If I have to say that again, it's going to be tricky because I will forget how it's pronounced. This world was not crowded, and it had been tweaked to render it compatible with a range of metabolic styles. The house had negotiated a site where they could live embodied in comfort if they wished. Jassim stirred and opened his eyes. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" "Older." "Really?" Layla paused to consider this seriously. "No, not even slightly. How about you?" "I'm fine. I'm just wondering what's out there." He raised himself up to peer through the window. The house had been instantiated on a wide, empty plain, covered with low stalks of green and yellow vegetation. They could eat these plants, and the house had already started a spice garden while they slept. He stretched his shoulders. "Let's go and make breakfast." They went downstairs, stepping into freshly minted bodies, then out into the garden. The air was still, the sun already warm. The house had tools prepared to help them with the harvest. It was the nature of travel that they had come empty-handed, and they had no relatives here, no 15th cousins, no friends of friends. It was the nature of the amalgam that they were welcome nonetheless, and the machines that supervised this world on behalf of its inhabitants had done their best to provide for them. "So this is the afterlife," Jassim mused, scything the yellow stalks. "Very rustic." "Speak for yourself," Layla retorted. "I'm not dead yet." She put down her own scythe and bent to pluck one of the plants out by its roots. The meal they made was filling, but bland. Layla resisted the urge to tweak her perceptions of it. She preferred to face the challenge of working out decent recipes, which would make a useful counterpoint to the more daunting task they'd come here to attempt. They spent the rest of the day just tramping around, exploring their immediate surroundings. The house had tapped into a nearby stream for water, and sunlight stored would provide all the power they needed. From some hills about an hour's walk away, they could see into a field with another building, but they decided to wait a little longer before introducing themselves to their neighbors. The air had a slightly odd smell due to the range of components needed to support other metabolic styles, but it wasn't too intrusive. The onset of night took them by surprise. Even before the sun had set, a smattering of stars began appearing in the east, and for a moment Layla thought that these white specks against the fading blue were some kind of exotic atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps small clouds forming in the stratosphere as the temperature dropped. When it became clear what was happening, she beckoned to Jassim to sit beside her on the bank of the stream and watch the stars of the bulge come out. They'd come at a time when Nasdeek lay between its sun and the galactic center. At dusk, one half of the Aloof's dazzling territory stretched from the eastern horizon to the zenith, with the stars' slow march westward against a darkening sky only revealing more of their splendor. You think that was to die for? Jassim joked as they walked back to the house.
We could end this now, if you're feeling unambitious.
He squeezed her hand. If this takes 10,000 years, I'm ready. It was a mild night. They could have slept outdoors, but the spectacle was too distracting. They stayed downstairs, in the physical wing. Layla watched the strange thicket of shadows cast by the furniture sliding across the walls. These neighbors never sleep, she thought. When we come knocking, they'll ask what took us so long.
Three.
Hundreds of observatories circled Nasdaq. Oh, jeez. Line break got me. Hundreds of observatories circled Nasdaq, built then abandoned by others who'd come on the same quest. When Layla saw the band of pristine space junk mapped out before her, orbits scrupulously maintained and swept clean by robot sentinels for eons, she felt as if she'd found the graves of their predecessors, stretching out in the field behind the house as far as the eye could see. Nasdaq was prepared to offer them the resources to loft another package of instruments into the vacuum if they wished, but many of the abandoned observatories were perfectly functional, and most had been left in a compliant state, willing to take instructions from anyone. Layla and Jassim sat in their living room and woke machine after machine from millennia of hibernation. Some, it turned out, had not been sleeping at all, but had been carrying on systematic observations, accumulating data long after their owners had lost interest. In the crowded stellar precincts of the bulge, disruptive gravitational effects made planet formation rarer than it was in the disk, and orbits less stable. Nevertheless, planets had been found. A few thousand could be tracked from Nasdaq, and one observatory had been monitoring their atmospheric spectra for the last 12 millennia. In all of those worlds, for all of those years, there were no signs of atmospheric composition departing from plausible, purely geochemical models. That meant no wildlife and no crude industries. It didn't prove that these worlds were uninhabited, but it suggested either that the aloof went to great lengths to avoid leaving chemical fingerprints, or they lived in an entirely different fashion to any of the civilizations that had formed in the amalgam. That had formed the amalgam. Sorry. Of the 11 forms of biochemistry that had been found scattered around the galactic disk, all had given rise eventually to hundreds of species with general intelligence. Of the multitude of civilizations that had emerged from those roots, all contained cultures that had granted themselves the flexibility of living as software, but they also all contained cultures that persisted with corporeal existence. Layla would never have willingly given up. Okay.
Sorry about that. That is not the last time that is going to happen today. There's probably going to be people knocking on my door. Or ringing the doorbell for once, which would be nice. Oh, where were we? Of the multitude of civilizations that had emerged from those roots, all contained cultures that had granted themselves the flexibility of living as software, but they also all contained cultures that persisted with corporeal existence. Layla would never have willingly given up either mode herself, but while it was easy to imagine a subculture doing so, for a whole species it seemed extraordinary. In a sense, the intertwined civilization of the amalgam owed its existence to the fact that there was as much cultural variation within every species as there was between one species and another. In that explosion of diversity, overlapping interests were inevitable. If the aloof were the exception, and their material culture had shrunk to nothing but a few discrete processors, each with the energy needs of a gnat scattered throughout a trillion cubic light years of dust and blazing stars, then finding them would be impossible. Of course, that worst case scenario couldn't quite be true. The sole reason the aloof were assumed to exist at all was the fact that some component of their material culture was tossing back every probe that was sent into the bulge. However discreet that machinery was, it certainly couldn't be sparse, given that it had managed to track, intercept, and reverse the trajectories of billions of individual probes that had been sent in along thousands of different routes. Relativistic constraints on the information flow implied that the aloof had some kind of presence at more or less every star at the edge of the bulge. Layla and Jassim had Nasdik brief them on the most recent attempts to enter the bulge, but even after 40,000 years, the basic facts hadn't changed. There was no crisply delineated barrier marking the aloof's territory, but at some point within a border region about 50 light years wide, every single probe that was sent in ceased to function. The signals from those carrying in-flight beacons or transmitters went dead without warning. A century or so later, they would appear again, almost at the same point. At almost the same point, traveling in the opposite direction, back to where they'd come from. Those that were retrieved and examined were found to be unharmed, but their data logs contained nothing from the missing decades. Jassim said, "The aloof could be dead and gone. They built the perfect fence, but now it's outlasted them. It's just guarding their ruins." Layla rejected this emphatically. No civilization that's spread to more than one star system has ever vanished completely. Sometimes they've changed beyond recognition, but not one has ever died without descendants. "That's a fact of history, but it's not a universal law," Jassim persisted. "If we're going to argue from the amalgam all the time, we'll get nowhere. If the aloof weren't exceptional, we wouldn't be here."
That's true, but I won't accept that they're dead until I see some evidence.
"What would count as evidence, apart from a million years of silence?"
Layla said, "Silence could mean anything. If they're really dead, we'll find something more, something definite.
"Such as?"
If we see it, we'll know."
They began the project in earnest, reviewing data from the ancient observatories, stopping only to gather food, eat, and sleep. They had resisted making detailed plans back on Najib, reasoning that any approach they mapped out in advance was likely to be rendered obsolete once they learned about the latest investigations. Now that they'd arrived and found the state of play utterly unchanged, Layla wished that they'd come armed with some clear options for dealing with the one situation they could have prepared for before they'd left. In fact, though, they might have felt like out of touch amateurs back on Najib. Oh, whoops, I misread the comma. Sorry.
In fact, though they might have felt like out-of-touch amateurs back on Najib, now that the aloof had become their entire raison d'etre, it was far harder to relax and indulge in the kind of speculation that might actually bear fruit, given that every systematic approach had failed. Having come 20,000 light years for this, they couldn't spend their time daydreaming, turning the problem over in the backs of their minds while they surrendered to the rhythms of Nasdaq's rural idyll. So they studied everything that had been tried before, searching methodically for a new approach, hoping to see the old ideas with fresh eyes, hoping that, by chance, if for no other reason, they might lack some crucial blind spot that had afflicted all of their predecessors. After 7 months without results or inspiration, it was Jassim who finally dragged them out of the rut. "We're getting nowhere," he said. "It's time to accept that, put all this aside, and go visit the neighbors." Layla stared at him as if he'd lost his mind.
Go visit them? How? What makes you think that they're suddenly going to let us in?
He said, "The neighbors. Remember? Over the hill? The ones who might actually want to talk to us?" Four. Their neighbors had published a precis, stating that they welcomed social contact in principle, but might take a while to respond. Jassim sent them an invitation, asking if they'd like to join them in their house, and waited. After just 3 days, a reply came back. The neighbors did not want to put them to the trouble of altering their own house physically, and preferred not to become acorporeal at present. Given the less stringent requirements of Layla and Jassim's own species when embodied, might they wish to come instead to the neighbor's house? Layla said,
Why not?
They set a date and time. The neighbor's precis, precis? It's pray. For some reason, I don't remember how to pronounce PR accented ECIS. It's the it's what you have as like a before document, like a heads up document. I forget how to pronounce it. Pracis included all the biological and sociological details needed to prepare for the encounter. Their biochemistry was carbon-based and oxygen-breathing, but employed a different replicator to Layla and Jassim's DNA. Their ancestral phenotype resembled a large furred snake, and when embodied they generally lived in nests of 100 or so. The minds of the individuals were perfectly autonomous, but solitude was an alien and unsettling concept for them. Layla and Jassim set out late in the morning, in order to arrive early in the afternoon. There were some low, heavy clouds in the sky, but it was not completely overcast, and Layla noticed that when the sun passed behind the clouds, she could discern some of the brightest stars from the edge of the bulge. Jassim admonished her sternly. "Stop looking. This is our day off." The snake's building was a large squat cylinder resembling a water tank, which turned out to be packed with something mossy and pungent. When they arrived at the entrance, 3 of their hosts were waiting to greet them, coiled on the ground near the mouth of a large tunnel emerging from the moss. Their bodies were almost as wide as their guests, and some 8 or 10 meters long. Their heads bore 2 front-facing eyes, but their other sense organs were not prominent. Layla could make out their mouths, and knew from the briefing how many rows of teeth lay behind them, but the wide pink gashes stayed closed, almost lost in the gray fur. The snakes communicated with a low-frequency thumping, and their system of nomenclature was complex, so Layla just mentally tagged the 3 of them with randomly chosen, slightly exotic names: Tim, John, and Sarah, and tweaked her translator so she'd recognize intuitively who was addressing her, and the significance of their gestures.
Welcome to our home, said Tim enthusiastically.
"Thank you for inviting us." Jassim replied.
We've had no visitors for quite some time, explained Sarah, so we really are delighted to meet you.
How long has it been? Layla asked.
20 years.
But we came here for the quiet life, John added, so we expected it would be a while.
Layla pondered the idea of a clan of 100 ever finding a quiet life, but then perhaps unwelcome intrusions from outsiders were of a different nature to family dramas.
Will you come into the nest? Tim asked. If you don't wish to enter, we won't take offense, but everyone would like to see you, and some of us aren't comfortable coming out into the open.
Layla glanced at Jassim. He said privately, "We can push our vision to IR and tweak ourselves to tolerate the smell." Layla agreed. "Okay," Jassim told Tim. Tim slithered into the tunnel and vanished in a quick, elegant motion. Then John motioned with his head for the guests to follow. Layla went first, propelling herself up the gentle slope with her knees and elbows. The plant the snakes cultivated for the nest formed a cool, dry, resilient surface. She could see Tim 10 meters or so ahead, like a giant glowworm shining with body heat, slowing down now to let her catch up. She glanced back at Jassim, who looked even weirder than the snakes now, his face and arms blotched with strange bands of radiance from the exertion. After a few minutes they came to a large chamber. The air was humid, but after the confines of the tunnel it felt cool and fresh. Tim led them toward the center, where about a dozen other snakes were already waiting to greet them. They circled the guests excitedly, thumping out a delighted welcome. Layla felt a surge of adrenaline. She knew that she and Jassim were in no danger, but the sheer size and energy of the creatures was overwhelming.
Can you tell us why you've come to Nasdaq?
Asked Sarah.
Of course.
For a second or two, Layla tried to maintain eye contact with her, but like all the other snakes, she kept moving restlessly, a gesture that Layla's translator imbued with a sense of warmth and enthusiasm. As for lack of eye contact, the snake's own translators would understand perfectly that some aspects of ordinary, polite human behavior became impractical under the circumstances, and would not mislabel her actions.
We're here to learn about the aloof, she said.
The aloof?
At first, Sarah just seemed perplexed. Then Layla's translator hinted at a touch of irony.
But they offer us nothing.
Layla was tongue-tied for a moment. The implication was subtle, but unmistakable. Citizens of the Amalgam had a protocol for dealing with each other's curiosity. They published a praecis, which spelled out clearly any information that they wished people in general to know about them, and also specified what, if any, further inquiries would be welcome. However, a citizen was perfectly entitled to publish no praecis at all, and have that decision respected. When no information was published and no invitation offered, you simply had no choice but to mind your own business.
They offer us nothing as far as we can tell, she said, but that might be a misunderstanding, a failure to communicate. They sent back all the probes, Tim replied. Do you really think we've misunderstood what that means?
Jassim said, "It means that they don't want us physically intruding on their territory, putting our machines right next to their homes, but I'm not convinced that it proves that they have no desire to communicate whatsoever."
We should leave them in peace, Tim insisted. They've seen the probes, so they know we're here. If they want to make contact, they'll do it in their own time.
Leave them in peace,
echoed another snake. A chorus of affirmation followed from others in the chamber. Layla stood her ground.
We have no idea how many different species and cultures might be living in the bulge. One of them sends back the probes, but for all we know, there could be 1,000 others who don't yet even know that the amalgam has tried to make contact.
This suggestion set off a series of arguments, some between guests and hosts, some between the snakes themselves. All the while, the snakes kept circling excitedly, while new ones entered the chamber to witness the novel sight of these strangers. When the clamor about the aloof had quietened down enough for her to change the subject, Layla asked Sarah, "Why have you come to Nasdik yourself?"
It's out of the way, off the main routes. We can think things over here, undisturbed. But you could have the same amount of privacy anywhere. It's all a matter of what you put in your precious.
Sarah's response was imbued with a tinge of amusement.
For us, it would be unimaginably rude to cut off all contact explicitly, by decree, especially with others from our own ancestral species. To live a quiet life, we had to reduce the likelihood of encountering anyone who would seek us out. We had to make the effort of rendering ourselves physically remote in order to reap the benefits.
Yet you've made Jassim and myself very welcome.
Of course, but that will be enough for the next 20 years.
So much for resurrecting their social life.
What exactly is the problem you're pondering in this state of solitude? The nature of reality, the uses of existence, the reasons to live, and the reasons not to.
Layla felt the skin on her forearms tingle. She'd almost forgotten that she'd made an appointment with death, however uncertain the timing. She explained how she and Jassim had made their decision to embark on a grand project before dying.
That's an interesting approach, Sarah said. I'll have to give it some thought.
She paused, then added,
Though I'm not sure that you've solved the problem.
"What do you mean?"
Will it really be easier now to choose the right moment to give up your life? Haven't you merely replaced one delicate judgment with an even more difficult one? Deciding when you've exhausted the possibilities for contacting the aloof?
You make it sound as if we have no chance of succeeding. Layla was not afraid of the prospect of failure, but the suggestion that it was inevitable was something else entirely. Sarah said,
We've been here on Nasdik for 15,000 years. We don't pay much attention to the world outside the nest, but even from this cloistered state, we've seen many people break their backs against this rock.
"So when will you accept that your own project is finished?" Layla countered. If you still don't have what you're looking for after 15,000 years, when will you admit defeat?"
I have no idea,
Sarah confessed.
I have no idea any more than you do.
"5. When the way forward first appeared, there was nothing to set it apart from 1,000 false alarms that had come before it. It was their 17th year on Nasdik. They had launched their own observatory, armed with the latest refinements culled from around the galaxy, 15 years before, and it had been confirming the null results of its predecessors ever since. They had settled into an unhurried routine, systematically exploring the possibilities that observation hadn't yet ruled out. Between the scenarios that were obviously stone cold dead, the presence of an energy rich, risk taking, extroverted civilization in the bulge actively seeking contact by every means at its disposal, and the infinite number of possibilities that could never be distinguished at this distance from the absence of all life, and the absence of all machinery save one dumb but efficient gatekeeper, tantalizing clues would bubble up out of the data now and then, only to fade into statistical insignificance in the face of continued scrutiny. Tens of billions of stars lying within the aloof's territory could be discerned from Nasdik, some of them evolving or violently interacting on a timescale of years or months. Black holes were flaying and swallowing their companions. Neutron stars and white dwarfs were stealing fresh fuel and flaring into novas. Star clusters were colliding and tearing each other apart. If you gathered data on this whole menagerie for long enough, you could expect to see almost anything. Layla would not have been surprised to wander into the garden at night and find a great welcome sign spelled out in the sky, before the fortuitous pattern of novas faded and the message dissolved into randomness again. When their gamma ray telescope caught a glimmer of something odd, the nuclei of a certain isotope of fluorine decaying from an excited state, when there was no nearby source of the kind of radiation that could have put the nuclei into that state in the first place, it might have just been another random, unexplained fact to add to a vast pile. When the same glimmer was seen again, not far away, Layla reasoned that if a gas cloud enriched with fluorine could be affected at one location by an unseen radiation source, it should not be surprising if the same thing happened elsewhere in the same cloud. It happened again. The three events lined up in space and time in a manner suggesting a short pulse of gamma rays in the form of a tightly focused beam, striking three different points in the gas cloud. Still, in the mountains of data they had acquired from their predecessors, coincidences far more compelling than this had occurred hundreds of thousands of times. With the fourth flash, the balance of the numbers began to tip. The secondary gamma rays reaching Nasdaq gave only a weak and distorted impression of the original radiation, but all four flashes were consistent with a single, narrow beam. There were thousands of known gamma ray sources in the bulge, but the frequency of the radiation, the direction of the beam, and the time profile of the pulse did not fit with any of them. The archives revealed a few dozen occasions when the same kind of emissions had been seen from fluorine nuclei under similar conditions. There had never been more than three connected events before, but one sequence had occurred along a path not far from the present one. Layla sat by the stream and modeled the possibilities. If the beam was linking two objects in powered flight, prediction was impossible. If receiver and transmitter were mostly in free fall, though, and only made corrections occasionally, the past and present data combined gave her a plausible forecast for the beam's future orientation. Jassim looked into her simulation, a thought bubble of stars and equations hovering above the water. "The whole path will lie out of bounds," he said. "No kidding." The Aloof's territory was more or less spherical, which made it a convex set. You couldn't get between any two points that lay inside it without entering the territory itself.
But look how much the beam spreads out. From the fluorine data, I'd say it could be tens of kilometers wide by the time it reaches the receiver.
So they might not catch it at all? They might let some of the beam escape into the disk? He sounded unpersuaded.
Layla said, "Look, if they really were doing everything possible to hide this, we would never have seen these blips in the first place."
Gas clouds with this much fluorine are extremely rare. They obviously picked a frequency that wouldn't be scattered under ordinary circumstances.
Yes, but that's just a matter of getting the signal through the local environment. We choose frequencies ourselves that won't interact with any substance that's likely to be present along the route, but no choice is perfect, and we just live with that. It seems to me they've done the same thing. If they were fanatical purists, they'd communicate by completely different methods.
All right. Jassim reached into the model. So where can we go that's in the line of sight? The short answer was nowhere. If the beam was not blocked completely by its intended target, it would spread out considerably as it made its way through the galactic disk, but it would not grow so wide that it would sweep across a single point where the amalgam had any kind of outpost.
Layla said, "This is too good to miss. We need to get a decent observatory into its path."
Jassim agreed, and we need to do it before these nodes decide they've drifted too close to something dangerous and switch on their engines for a course correction.
They crunched through the possibilities. Wherever the amalgam had an established presence, the infrastructure already on the ground could convert data into any kind of material object.
Transmitting yourself to such a place, along with whatever you needed, was simplicity itself. Light speed was the only real constraint. Excessive demands on the local resources might be denied, but modest requests were rarely rejected. Far more difficult was building something new at a site with raw materials but no existing receiver. In that case, instead of pure data, you needed to send an engineering spore of some kind. If you were in a hurry, not only did you need to spend energy boosting the spore to relativistic velocities, a cost that snowballed due to the mass of protective shielding, you then had to waste much of the time you gained on a lengthy braking phase, or the spore would hit its target with enough energy to turn it into plasma. Interactions with the interstellar medium could be used to slow down the spore, avoiding the need to carry yet more mass to act as a propellant for braking, but the whole business was disgustingly inefficient. Harder still was getting anything substantial to a given point in the vast empty space between the stars. With no raw materials to hand at the destination, everything had to be moved from somewhere else. The best starting point was usually to send an engineering spore into a cometary cloud, loosely bound gravitationally to its associated star, but not every such cloud was open to plunder, and everything took time and obscene amounts of energy. To arrange for an observatory to be delivered to the most accessible point along the beam's line of sight, traveling at the correct velocity, would take about 15,000 years all told. That assumed that the local cultures who owned the nearest facilities, and who had a right to veto the use of the raw materials, acceded immediately to their request.
How long between course corrections?
Layla wondered. If the builders of this hypothetical network were efficient, the nodes could drift for a while in interstellar space without any problems. But in the bulge, everything happened faster than in the disk, and the need to counter gravitational effects would come much sooner. There was no way to make a firm prediction, but they could easily have as little as 8 or 10,000 years. Layla struggled to reconcile herself to the reality.
We'll try at this location, and if we're lucky, we might still catch something. If not, we'll try again after the beam shifts.
Sending the first observatory chasing after the beam would be futile. Even with the present free-fall motion of the nodes, the observation point would be moving at a substantial fraction of light speed relative to the local stars. Magnified by the enormous distances involved, a small change in direction down in the bulge could see the beam lurch thousands of light years sideways by the time it reached the disk. Jasim said, "Wait." He magnified the region around the projected path of the beam.
What are you looking for?
He asked the map. "Are there two outposts of the amalgam lying on the straight line that intersects the beam?" The map replied in a tone of mild incredulity. "No." "That was too much to hope for. Are there three lying on a plane that intersects the beam?" The map said, "There are about 10 to the 18 triples that meet that condition." Layla suddenly realized what it was he had in mind. She laughed and squeezed his arm.
You are completely insane!
Jasim said, "Let me get the numbers right first, then you can mock me." He rephrased his question to the map. For how many of those triples would the beam pass between them, intersecting the triangle whose vertices they lie on? "About 10 to the sixth." "How close to us is the closest point of intersection of the beam with any of those triangles? If the distance in each case is measured via the worst of the three outposts, the one that makes the total path longest." 7,426 light years."
Layla said, collision breaking with 3 components?
"Do you have a better idea?"
Better than twice as fast at the fastest conventional method? Nothing comes to mind. Let me think about it.
Braking against the flimsy interstellar medium was a slow process. If you wanted to deliver a payload rapidly to a point that fortuitously lay somewhere on a straight line between two existing outposts, you could fire two separate packages from the two locations and let them collide when they met. Or rather, let them break against each other magnetically. If you arranged for the packages to have equal and opposite momenta, they would come to a halt without any need to throw away reaction mass or clutch at passing molecules, and some of their kinetic energy could be recovered as electricity and stored for later use. The aim and the timing had to be perfect. Relativistic packages did not make in-flight course corrections, and the data available at each launch site about the other's precise location was always a potentially imperfect prediction, not a rock-solid statement of fact. Even with the amalgam's prodigious astrometric and computing resources, achieving millimeter alignments at 1,000 light-year distances could not be guaranteed. Now Jassim wanted to make 3 of these bullets meet, perform an elaborate electromagnetic dance, and end up with just the right velocity needed to keep tracking the moving target of the beam. In the evening, back in the house, they sat together working through simulations. It was easy to find designs that would work if everything went perfectly, but they kept hunting for the most robust variation, the one that was most tolerant of small misalignments. With standard two-body collision braking, the usual solution was to have the first package, shaped like a cylinder, pass right through a hole in the second package. As it emerged from the other side and the two moved apart again, the magnetic fields were switched from repulsive to attractive. Several bounces followed, and in the process as much of the kinetic energy as possible was gradually converted into superconducting currents for storage, while the rest was dissipated as electromagnetic radiation. Having 3 objects meeting at an angle would not only make the timing and positioning more critical, it would destroy the simple axial symmetry and introduce a greater risk of instability. It was dawn before they settled on the optimal design, which effectively split the problem in 2. First, Package 1, a sphere, would meet Package 2, a torus, threading the gap in the middle, then bouncing back and forth through it 17 times. The plane of the torus would lie at an angle to its direction of flight, allowing the sphere to approach it head on. When the two finally came to rest with respect to each other, they would still have a component of their velocity carrying them straight toward Package 3, a cylinder with an axial borehole. Because the electromagnetic interactions were the same as the two-body case, self-centering, intrinsically stable, a small amount of misalignment at each of these encounters would not be fatal. The usual two-body case, though, didn't require the combined package, after all the bouncing and energy dissipation was completed, to be moving on a path so precisely determined that it could pass through yet another narrow hoop. There were no guarantees, and in the end the result would be in other people's hands. They could send requests to the 3 outposts, asking for these objects to be launched at the necessary times on the necessary trajectories. The energy needs hovered on the edge of politeness, though, and it was possible that one or more of the requests would simply be refused. Jassim waved the models away, and they stretched out on the carpet, side by side. He said, "I never thought we'd get this far. Even if this is only a mirage, I never thought we'd find one worth chasing." Layla said, "I don't know what I expected. Some kind of great folly. Some long, exhausting, exhilarating struggle that felt like wandering through a jungle for years and ending up utterly lost." "And then what?"
"Surrender."
Jassim was silent for a while. Layla could sense that he was brooding over something, but she didn't press him. He said, "Should we travel to this observatory ourselves, or wait here for the results?"
"We should go. Definitely. I don't want to hang around here for 15,000 years, waiting. We can leave the Nasdaq observatories hunting for more beam fluorescence and broadcasting the results, so we'll hear about them wherever we end up."
"That makes sense. Jassim hesitated, then added, "When we go, I don't want to leave a backup."
Ah,
They'd traveled from Najib, leaving nothing of themselves behind. If their transmission had somehow failed to make it to Nasdaq, no stored copy of the data would ever have woken to resume their truncated lives. Travel within the Amalgam's established network carried... Sorry? Ugh. Travel within the Amalgam's established network carried negligible risks, though. If they flung themselves toward the hypothetical location of this yet-to-be-assembled station in the middle of nowhere, it was entirely possible that they'd sail off to infinity without ever being instantiated again.
Layla said, "Are you tired of what we're doing? Of what we've become?
It's not that.
This one chance isn't the be-all and end-all. Now that we know how to hunt for the beams, I'm sure we'll find this one again after its shifts. We could find 1,000 others if we're persistent."
I know that, he said. I don't want to stop. I don't want to end this. But I want to risk ending it. Just once. While that still means something.
Layla sat up and rested her head on her knees. She could understand what he was feeling, but it still disturbed her.
Jassim said, "We've already achieved something extraordinary. No one's found a clue like this in a million years. If we leave that to posterity, it will be pursued to the end. We can be sure of that. But I desperately want to pursue it myself. With you."
And because you want that so badly, you need to face the chance of losing it?
Yes. It was one thing they had never tried. In their youth, they would never have knowingly risked death. They'd been too much in love, too eager for the life they'd yet to live. The stakes would have been unbearably high. In the twilight years, back on Najib, it would have been an easy thing to do, but an utterly insipid pleasure. Jassim sat up. Jassim sat up and took her hand. "Have I hurt you with this?"
No, no.
She shook her head pensively, trying to gather her thoughts. She didn't want to hide her feelings, but she wanted to express them precisely, not blurt them out in a confusing rush.
Here we go. I take it back. There we don't go. Wasn't a blocked call. They just called the wrong number, maybe? I don't know. And then realized it. I don't know. Where were we?
She didn't want to hide her feelings, but she wanted to express them precisely, not blurt them out in a confusing rush.
I always thought we'd reach the end together, though. We'd come to some point in the jungle, look around, exchange a glance, and know that we'd arrived, without even needing to say it aloud.
Jassim drew her to him and held her. "All right. I'm sorry. Forget everything I said."
Layla pushed him away, annoyed. This isn't something you can take back. If it's the truth, it's the truth. Just give me some time to decide what I want.
They put it aside and buried themselves in work, polishing the design for the new observatory, preparing the requests to send to the 3 outposts. One of the planets would be petitioning. One of the planets they would be petitioning belonged to the snakes, so Layla and Jassim went to visit the nest for a second time, to seek advice on the best way to beg for this favor. Their neighbors seemed more excited just to see them again than they were at the news that a tiny rent had appeared in the aloof's million-year-old cloak of discretion. When Layla gently pushed her on this point, Sarah said,
You're here and now, our guests in flesh and blood. I'm sure I'll be dead long before the aloof are willing to do the same.
Layla thought, what kind of strange greed is it that I'm suffering from?
I can be feted by creatures who rose up from the dust through a completely different molecule than my own ancestors. I can sit among them and discuss the philosophy of life and death. The amalgam has already joined every willing participant in the galaxy into one vast conversation. And I want to go and eavesdrop on the aloof, just because they've played hard to get for 1,000,000 years? They dispatched requests for the 3 modules to be built and launched by their 3 as yet unwitting collaborators, specifying the final countdown to the nanosecond but providing a 10-year period for the project to be debated. Layla felt optimistic. However blasé the Nasdaq nest had been, she suspected that no spacefaring culture really could resist the chance to peek behind the veil. They had 36 years to wait before they followed in the wake of their petitions. On top of the 10-year delay, the new observatory's modules would be traveling at a fraction of a percent below light speed, so they needed a head start. No more telltale gamma-ray flashes appeared from the bulge, but Layla hadn't expected any so soon. They had sent the news of their discovery to other worlds close to the Aloof's territory, so eventually 1,000 other groups with different vantage points would be searching for the same kind of evidence and finding their own ways to interpret and exploit it. It hurt a little, scattering their hard-won revelation to the wind for anyone to use, perhaps even to beat them to some far greater prize. But they'd relied on the generosity of their predecessors from the moment they'd arrived on Nasdaq, and the sheer scale of the overall problem made it utterly perverse to cling selfishly to their own small triumph. As the day of their departure finally arrived, Layla came to a decision. She understood Jasim's need to put everything at risk, and in a sense she shared it. If she had always imagined the two of them ending this together, struggling on side by side until the way forward was lost and the undergrowth closed in on them, then that was what she'd risk. She would take the flip side to his own wager. When the house took their minds apart and sent them off to chase the beam, Layla left a copy of herself frozen on Nasdaq. If no word of their safe arrival reached it by the expected time, it would wake and carry on the search. Alone. Six.
Welcome to Trident. We're honored by the presence of our most distinguished guest.
Jasim stood beside the bed, waving a triangular flag. Oh, wait, it was him.
Welcome to Trident. We're honored by the presence of our most distinguished guest.
Jasim stood beside the bed, waving a triangular flag. Red, green, and blue in the corners merged to white in the center. How long have you been up?
About an hour, he said.
Layla frowned, and he added apologetically,
You were sleeping very deeply. I didn't want to disturb you.
I should be the one giving the welcome, she said. You're the one who might never have woken. The bedroom window looked out into a dazzling field of stars. It was not a view facing the bulge. By now Layla could recognize the distinctive spectra of the region's stars with ease. But even these disk stars were so crisp and bright that this was like no sky she had ever seen. Have you been downstairs? She said.
Not yet. I wanted us to decide on that together.
The house had no physical wing here. The tiny observatory had no spare mass for such frivolities as embodying them, let alone constructing architectural follies in the middle of interstellar space. Downstairs would be nothing but a scape that they were free to design at will. Everything worked, she said, not quite believing it. Jasim spread his arms.
We're here, aren't we?
They watched a reconstruction of the first 2 modules coming together. The timing and the trajectories were as near to perfect as they could have hoped for, and the superconducting magnets had been constructed to a standard of purity and homogeneity that made the magnetic embrace look like an idealized simulation.
By the time the two had locked together, the third module was just minutes away. Some untraceable discrepancy between reality and prediction in the transfer of momentum to radiation had the composite moving at a tiny angle away from its expected course. But when it met the third module, the magnetic field still meshed in a stable configuration, and there was energy to spare to nudge the final assembly precisely into step with the predicted swinging of the Aloof's beam. The amalgam had lived up to its promise. 3 worlds full of beings that they had never met, who owed them nothing, who did not even share their molecular ancestry, had each diverted enough energy to light up all their cities for a decade, and followed the instructions of strangers down to the atom, down to the nanosecond, in order to make this work. What happened now was entirely in the hands of the Aloof. Trident had been functioning for about a month before its designers had arrived to take up occupancy. So far, it had not yet observed any gamma-ray signals spilling out of the bulge. The particular pulse that Layla and Jassim had seen triggering fluorescence would be long gone, of course, but the usefulness of their present location was predicated on 3 assumptions. The Aloof would use the same route for many other bursts of data. Some of the radiation carrying that data would slip past the intended receiver, and the 2 nodes of the network would have continued in free fall long enough for the spilt data to be arriving here still, along the same predictable path. Without those 3 extra components, delivered by their least reliable partners, Trident would be worthless.
Downstairs, Layla said. Maybe a kind of porch with glass walls?
Sounds fine to me. She conjured up a plan of the house and sketched some ideas. Then they went down to try them out at full scale. They had been into orbit around Najib, and they had traveled embodied to its 3 beautiful, barren sibling worlds, but they had never been in interstellar space before. Or at least, they had never been conscious of it. They were still not truly embodied, but you didn't need flesh and blood to feel the vacuum around you. To be awake and plugged in to an honest depiction of your surroundings was enough. The nearest of Trident's contributor worlds was 600 light years away. The distance to Najib was unthinkable. Layla paced around the porch, looking out at the stars, vertiginous in her virtual body, unsteady in the phony gravity. It had been 28,000 years since they'd left Najib. All her children and grandchildren had almost certainly chosen death long ago. No messages had been sent after them to Nasdik. Layla had asked for that silence, fearing that it would be unbearably painful to hear news day after day to which she could give no meaningful reply, about events in which she could never participate. Now she regretted that. She wanted to read the lives of her grandchildren, as she might the biography of an ancestor. She wanted to know how things had ended up, like the time traveler she was. A second month of observation passed, with nothing. A data feed reaching them from Nasdik was equally silent. For any new hint of the beam's location to reach Nasdik, and then the report of that to reach Trident, would take thousands of years longer than the direct passage of the beam itself. So if Nasdik saw evidence that the beam was still on course, that would be old news about a pulse they had not let's try this sentence again because it's long and meandering. For any new hint of the beam's location to reach Nasdik, and then the report of that to reach Trident, would take thousands of years longer than the direct passage of the beam itself. So, if Nasdik saw evidence that the beam was still on course, that would be old news about a pulse they had not been here to intercept. However, if Nasdik reported that the beam had shifted, at least that would put them out of their misery immediately, and tell them that Trident had been built too late. Jassim made a vegetable garden on the porch and grew exotic food in the starlight. Layla played along and ate beside him. It was a harmless game. They could have painted anything at all around the house. Any planet they'd visited, drawn from their memories, any imaginary world. If this small pretense was enough to keep them sane and anchored to reality, so be it. Now and then, Layla felt the strangest of the many pangs of isolation Trident induced. Here, the knowledge of the galaxy was no longer at her fingertips. Their descriptions as travelers had encoded their vast personal memories, declarative and episodic, and their luggage had included prodigious libraries, but she was used to having so much more. Every civilized planet held a storehouse of information that was simply too bulky to fit into Trident, along with a constant feed of exabytes of news flooding in from other worlds. Wherever you were in the galaxy, some news was old news, some cherished theories long discredited, some facts hopelessly out of date. Here, though, Layla knew, there were billions of rigorously established truths, the results of hundreds of millennia of thought, experiment, and observation, that had slipped out of her reach. Questions that any other child of the amalgam could expect to have answered instantly would take 1,200 years to receive a reply. No such questions actually came into her mind, but there were still moments when the mere fact of it was enough to make her feel unbearably rootless, cut adrift not only from her past and her people, but from civilization itself. Trident shouted, "Data!" Layla was halfway through recording a postcard to the Nasdaq snakes. Jassim was on the porch watering his plants. Layla turned to see him walking through the wall, commanding the bricks to part like a gauze curtain. They stood side by side, watching the analysis emerge. A pulse of gamma rays of the expected frequency, from precisely the right location, had just washed over Trident. The beam was greatly attenuated by distance, not to mention having had most of its energy intercepted by its rightful owner, but more than enough had slipped past and reached them for Trident to make sense of the nature of the pulse. It was, unmistakably, modulated with information. There were precisely repeated phase shifts in the radiation that were unimaginable in any natural gamma ray source, and which would have been pointless in any artificial beam produced for any purpose besides communication. The pulse had been 3 seconds long, carrying about 10 to the 24th bits of data. That's how many bytes? 10 to the 24th? Or 1 to the 24th? 10 to the 24th bits. Bits, not bytes, so I have to remember to multiply by 8. Where are you, calculator? Will this cover it? That's not a calculator. That's a calculator. 10 to the... Nope, not squared. Oh. Where's advanced scientific? There we go. Much better. To the 24th. Jesus, that's a lot. Times 8. Okay, that's kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, whatever's bigger than terabytes. Is that petabytes or is that zettabytes? 24th prefix Yocto. We got Yoctos. Yocto Bros. We've won. So that's 8 Yocto bytes. Yocto bits. It's 8 Yocto bits. It's divide by 8, you goober. And then divide by 8 again. Which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 21, 10 to the 21st bytes. 10 to the 21st. 10 to the 21st. Prefix. Zepto. 125 zeptobytes. There we go. Science. So it's 10 yoctobytes, I think, and 8 zeptobytes. Yoctobits. And it's a zeptobyte. It's a yoctobit and a zeptobyte. So yeah, 125 zeptobytes. 1 yoctobit. There we go. Took me a second to get my brain around the fact that I was doing all of that wrong. It's okay. I've probably muffed something there. It's a lot. Suffice it to say, it's a lot of friggin' data. The pulse had been 3 seconds long, carrying about 10 to the 24th bits of data. The bulk of this appeared to be random, but that did not rule out meaningful content. It simply implied efficient encryption. The amalgam's network sent encrypted data via robust classical channels like this, while sending the keys needed to decode it by a second quantum channel. Layla had never expected to get a hold of unencrypted data, laying bare the secrets of the aloof in an instant. To have clear evidence that someone in the bulge was talking to someone else, and to have pinned down part of the pathway connecting them, was vindication enough. There was more, though. Between the messages themselves, Trident had identified brief, orderly, unencrypted sequences. Everything was guesswork to a degree, but with such a huge slab of data, statistical measures were powerful indicators. Part of the data looked like routing information, addresses for the messages as they were carried through the network. Another part looked like information about the node's current and future trajectories. If Trident really had cracked that, they could work out where to position its successor. In fact, if they placed the successor close enough to the bulge, they could probably keep that one observatory constantly inside the spill from the beam. Jassim couldn't resist playing devil's advocate. You know, this could just be one part of whatever throws the probes back in our faces, talking to another part. The aloof themselves could still be dead, while their security system keeps humming with paranoid gossip. Layla said blithely, "Hypothesize away. I'm not taking the bait." She turned to embrace him, and they kissed. She said, "I've forgotten how to celebrate. What happens now?" He moved his fingertips gently along her arm. Layla opened up the scape, creating a fourth spatial dimension. She took his hand, kissed it, and placed it against her beating heart. Their bodies reconfigured, nerve endings crowding every surface, inside and out. Jassim climbed inside her, and she inside him, the topology of the scape changing to wrap them together in a mutual embrace. Everything vanished from their lives but pleasure, triumph, and each other's presence, as close as it could ever be. 7.
Are you here for the listening party?
The chitinous heptapod, who'd been wandering the crowded street with a food cart dispensing largesse at random, offered Layla a plate of snacks tailored to her and Jasim's preferences. She accepted it, then paused to let Tassef, the planet they'd just set foot on, brief her as to the meaning of this phrase. People, Tassef explained, had traveled to this world from throughout the region in order to witness a special event. Some 15,000 years before, a burst of data from the Aloof's network had been picked up by a nearby observatory. In isolation, these bursts meant very little. However, the locals were hopeful that at least one of several proposed observatories near Massa, on the opposite side of the bulge, would have seen spillage including many of the same data packets, 40,000 years before. If any such observations had in fact taken place, news of their precise contents should now, finally, be about to reach Tassif by the longer, disk-based routes of the Amalgam's own network. Once the two observatories could be compared, it would become clear which messages from the earlier eavesdropping session had made their way to the part of the Aloof's network that could be sampled from Tassif. The comparison would advance the project of mapping all the symbolic addresses seen in the data onto actual physical locations. To break that down a smidgen, because of the way interstellar distances and the whole light speed thing works, basically, if something happens X light years away, and say a signal is broadcast, say a laser, then or something slower, a radio wave, and you wanted to catch what it was, you would travel out a further distance at a faster speed, or if you're far enough away, you can wangle that, and then basically pick up on it, pick the echo up, however many light years out that you want to get an accurate reading from. Basically, every time you see, and this is basically what happens every time you see a supernova, or regular nova, or anything happening at great interstellar distance, is you're seeing something that happened however many thousand years ago or more, and you're getting the you're seeing what happened there. So that's basically what they're doing. Is there was a place that would have observed it 40,000 years ago, but now they're out at a location that's further out than that, and they're going to see it the next go round, further distance out. Basically, that's kind of oversimplifying, but it's more or less what they're doing. Layla said, "That's not why we came, but now we know, we're even more pleased to be here." The heptapod emitted a chirp that Layla understood as a gracious welcome, then pushed its way back into the throng. Jasim said, "Remember when you told me that everyone would get bored with the Aloof while we were still in transit?"
I said that would happen eventually. If not this trip, the next one.
Yes, but you said it 5 journeys ago. Layla scowled, preparing to correct him, but then she checked and he was right. They hadn't expected Tassif to be so crowded when they'd chosen it as their destination, some 10,000 years before. The planet had given them a small room in this city, Shaloof, and imposed a 1,000-year limit on their presence if they wished to remain embodied without adopting local citizenship. More than 1 billion visitors had arrived over the last 50 years, anticipating the news of the observations from Massa, but unable to predict the precise time it would reach Tassif because the details of the observatory's trajectories had still been in transit. She confessed,
I never thought 1 billion people would arrange their travel plans around this jigsaw puzzle.
Travel plans? Jasim laughed. We chose to have our own deaths revolve around the very same thing.
Yes, but we're just weird.
Jasim gestured at the crowded street. I don't think we can compete on that score. They wandered through the city, drinking in the decades-long carnival atmosphere. There were people of every phenotype Layla had encountered before, and more. Bipeds, quadrupeds, hexapods, heptapods, walking, shuffling, crawling, scuttling, or soaring high above the street on feathered, scaled, or membranous wings. Some were encased in their preferred atmospheres. Others, like Layla and Jassim, had chosen instead to be embodied in ersatz flesh that didn't follow every ancestral chemical dictate. Physics and geometry tied evolution's hands, and many attempts to solve the same problems had converged on similar answers. But the galaxy's different replicators still managed their idiosyncratic twists. When Layla let her translator sample the cacophony of voices and signals at random, she felt as if the whole disk, the whole amalgam, had converged on this tiny metropolis. In fact, most of the travelers had come just a few hundred light years to be here. She and Jassim had chosen to keep their role in the history of eavesdropping out of their precious, and Layla caught herself with a rather smug sense of walking among the crowd like some unacknowledged sage, bemused by the late blooming and no doubt superficial interest of the masses. On reflection, though, any sense of superior knowledge was hard to justify, when most of these people would have grown up steeped in developments that she was only belatedly catching up with. A new generation of observatories had been designed while she and Jassim were in transit, based on strong bullets, specially designed femtomachines, clusters of protons and neutrons, stable only for trillionths of a second, launched at ultra-relativistic speeds so great that time dilation enabled them to survive long enough to collide with other components and merge into tiny, short-lived gamma-ray observatories. The basic trick that had built Trident had gone from a one-off gamble into a miniaturized, mass-produced phenomenon, with literally billions of strong bullets being fired continuously from thousands of planets around the inner disk. Femtomachines themselves were old hat, but it had taken the technical challenges of eavesdropping to motivate someone into squeezing a few more tricks out of them. Historians had always understood that in the long run, technological progress was a horizontal asymptote. Once people had more or less everything they wanted that was physically possible, every incremental change would take exponentially longer to achieve, with diminishing returns and ever less reason to bother. The amalgam would probably spend an eon inching its way closer to the flat line, but this was proof that shifts of circumstance alone could still trigger a modest renaissance or two, without the need for any radical scientific discovery or even a genuinely new technology. Which I think is an interesting observation slash idea. They stopped to rest in a square. It's not a square-shaped object. I mean, it might be a square-shaped object, but my brain just decided to separate the way what the comma meant without reading further ahead. I'm sorry. I have to giggle at myself sometimes. That's one of the disadvantages of doing this live is sometimes I get lost in the sauce. Or one of the advantages, depending on your perspective. I know some people like it. Sometimes it drives me nuts. They stopped to rest in a square, beside a small fountain gushing aromatic hydrocarbons. The tassif locals, quadrupeds with slick, rubbery hides, played in the sticky black spray, then licked each other clean. Jassim shaded his eyes from the sun. He said, "We've had our autumn child. We've seen its grandchildren prosper. I'm not sure what's left." No. Layla was in no rush to die, but they'd sampled 50,000 years of their discovery's consequences. They'd followed in the wake of the news of the gamma-ray signals as it circled the inner disk, spending less than a century conscious as they sped from world to world. At first, they'd been hunting for some vital new role to play, but they'd slowly come to accept that the avalanche they'd triggered had outraced them. Physical and logical maps of the Aloof's network were being constructed as fast as the laws of physics allowed. Billions of people on thousands of planets, scattered around the inner rim of the amalgam's territory, were sharing their observations to help piece together the living skeleton of their elusive neighbors. When that project was complete, it would not be the end of anything, but it could mark the start of a long hiatus. The encrypted classical data would never yield anything more than traffic routes. No amount of ingenuity could extract its content. The quantum keys that could unlock it, assuming the aloof even used such things, would be absolutely immune to theft, duplication, or surreptitious sampling. One day there would be another breakthrough, and everything would change again. But did they want to wait 100,000 years, a million, just to see what came next? The sorry. Actually, thank you for tuning in, Matt Maria. Hi, Frag. I'm always listening to your streams in Oz, but now I'm in Spain, and can enjoy your readings and digressions live. Yes, you've made me a mad Peter Watts fan and Greg Egan devotee. Cheers, cheers indeed, Matt Maria. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, I at different points have had other folks from Australia who have tuned in. But I'm always like, isn't it like 1 a.m. for you right now? Isn't it, the middle of the night? What are you doing here? Get some sleep. So thanks for tuning in. Yeah, in Spain it'd be afternoon for you. So that's nice. Or evening really. Very nice. But yeah, Greg Egan, I'm glad he's he's a tough read to be honest. And the closer you get to present day, the more technical, the more esoteric his stuff becomes. This is around the time, because when was this published? This story, Writing the Crocodile. This has to be the aughts, I think. Could be the 90s. Writing the Crocodile was first published in 1 million AD, edited by Gardner Dozois. Science Fiction Book Club, 2005. Yeah, that sounds about right. If you like this stuff with a galaxy-spanning civilization where people are basically post-human and can do what they want, I recommend checking out. Not Distress. Diaspora. There it is. Diaspora, Shield's Ladder, and there's one other than short stories. There's a bunch of short stories that are kind of like this. I think there's a sequel to this one, in fact. Possibly even in this collection. If it's not, it's in one of his later ones, like Instantiation. I want to say Incandescence, maybe. I can't remember Incandescence off the top of my head. The plot of that one, I need to reread that. I know it's not Zendegi. Zendegi is like literally could happen tomorrow, very near future. It's about people. That's one of the things I like about science fiction. There's a certain kind of science fiction that I do like, where it's like, oh, okay, technological ramifications are cool, but how does this? It's really the art of studying how do people react to this? How do they live? And Greg Egan, in my opinion, is masterful of that in terms of, yeah, he's coming up with ever more esoteric and bizarre world states and settings for people to live in, and then they're just people. Like, oh yeah, they're 2.5 dimensional people who can't rotate on a 3-dimensional axis, or they get spindled out of existence, so they can only walk forward, back, left, and right, but they can't rotate. But they're still just basically people, with basic people needs, desires, and whatnot. So it's like, wait a minute, this is kind of boring. You live this wild universe, this utterly different dimension set, but you're just dudes and dudettes. And the sonar producing head parasites that live in your heads that can tell you what's to the side of you that you can't rotate to look at. People. That is my weekly plug of the book Dichronauts, which is still one of the wildest things I've ever read. Big, big props to Greg Egan. If anyone, incidentally, knows of other sci-fi writers who are doing stuff like Greg Egan is doing in terms of just really out there, ideas, please, please, please do not hesitate to message or leave it in the comments because, man, I love this stuff. I'm always looking for more. Okay, before I digressed, where were we? Oh, I was right at the top of the page. Very convenient. The solicitous heptapods, not locals, but visitors from a world 30 light years away, who had nonetheless taken on some kind of innate duty of hospitality, seemed to show up whenever anyone was hungry. Layla tried to draw this second one into conversation, but it politely excused itself to rush off and feed someone else. Layla said, "Maybe this is it. We'll wait for the news from Massa, then celebrate for a while, then finish it." Jassim took her hand. "That feels right to me. I'm not certain, but I don't think I'll ever be."
"Are you tired?" she said. "Bored?"
"Not at all," he replied. "I feel satisfied with what we've done, with what we've seen, and I don't want to dilute that. I don't want to hang around forever, watching it fade, until we start to feel the way we did on Najib all over again."
No.
They sat in the square until dusk, and watched the stars of the bulge come out. They'd seen this dazzling jeweled hub from every possible angle now, but Layla never grew tired of the sight. Jassim gave an amused, exasperated sigh. "That beautiful, maddening, unreachable place. I think the whole amalgam will be dead and gone without anyone setting foot inside it." Layla felt a sudden urge of irritation, which deepened into a sense of revulsion.
It's a place like any other place. Stars, gas, dust, planets. It's not some metaphysical realm. It's not even far away. Our own home world is 20 times more distant.
"Our own home world doesn't have an impregnable fence around it. If we really wanted to, we could go back there."
Layla was defiant. If we really wanted to, we could enter the bulge.
Jassim laughed. "Have you read something in those messages that you didn't tell me about? How to say 'Open Sesame' to the gatekeepers?"
Layla stood and summoned a map of the Aloof's network to superimpose across their vision, crisscrossing the sky with slender cones of violet light. Sorry, I think I said violent there at first. That's not true. One cone appeared head on as a tiny circle, the beam whose spillage came close to Tassif. She put her hand on Jassim's shoulder and zoomed in on that circle. It opened up before them like a beckoning tunnel. She said, "We don't know where this beam is coming from. We don't know for certain that the traffic between these particular nodes runs in both directions, but we've found plenty of examples where it does. If we aim a signal from here back along the path of the spillage, and we make it wide enough, then we won't just hit the sending node, we'll hit the receiver as well."
Jassim was silent.
"We know the data format," she continued. "We know the routing information. We can address the data packets to a node on the other side of the bulge, one where the spillage comes out at Massa."
Jassim said, What makes you think they'll accept the packets?"
"There's nothing in the format we don't understand, nothing we can't write for ourselves."
"Nothing in the unencrypted part. If there is an authorization, even a checksum, in the encrypted part, then any packet without that will be tossed away as noise."
"That's true," she conceded.
"Do you really want to do this?" he said.
Her hand was still on his shoulder, and she could feel his body growing tense. "Absolutely."
"We mail ourselves from here to Massa as unencrypted classical data that anyone can read, anyone can copy, anyone can alter or corrupt."
"A moment ago you said they'd throw us away as noise."
"That's the least of our worries."
"Maybe."
Jassim shuddered, his body almost convulsing. He let out a string of obscenities, then made a choking sound. "What's wrong with you? Is this some kind of test? If I call your bluff, will you admit that you're joking?"
Layla shook her head. And no, it's not revenge for what you did on the way to Trident. This is our chance. This is what we were waiting to do. Not the eavesdropping. That's nothing. The bulge is right here in front of us. The aloof are in there somewhere. We can't force them to engage with us, but we can get closer to them than anyone else has ever been before.
If we go in this way, they could do anything to us.
They're not barbarians. They haven't made war on us. Even the engineering spores come back unharmed.
If we infest their network, that's worse than an engineering spore.
Infest! None of these routes are crowded. A few exabytes passing through is nothing.
You have no idea how they'll react.
No, she confessed, I don't. But I'm ready to find out.
Jassim stood. We could send a test message first, then go to Massa and see if it arrived safely.
We could do that, Layla conceded. That would be a sensible plan.
So you agree? Jassim gave her a wary, frozen smile. We'll send a test message, send an encyclopedia, send greetings in some universal language.
Fine. We'll send all of those things first. But I'm not waiting more than 1 day after that. I'm not going to Massa the long way. I'm taking the shortcut. I'm going through the bulge.
Jeez Louise. Like 20 more pages. It's a long one. So probably another hour or so.
8.
The amalgam had been so generous to Layla, and the local interest in the aloof so intense, that she had almost forgotten that she was not, in fact, entitled to a limitless and unconditional flow of resources, to be employed to any end that involved her obsession. When she asked Tassif for the means to build a high-powered gamma-ray transmitter to aim into the bulge, it interrogated her for an hour, then replied that the matter would require a prolonged and extensive consultation. It was, she realized, no use protesting that compared to hosting 1 billion guests for a couple of centuries, the cost of this was nothing. The sticking point was not the energy use, or any other equally microscopic consequence for the comfort and amenity of the Tassif locals. The issue was whether her proposed actions might be seen as unwelcome and offensive by the aloof, and whether that affront might in turn provoke some kind of retribution. Countless probes and spores had been gently and patiently returned. What? Yep, nope, I read that correctly, never mind. Countless probes and spores had been gently and patiently returned from the bulge unharmed, but they'd come blundering in at less than light speed. A flash of gamma rays could not be intercepted and returned before it struck its chosen target. Though it seemed to Layla that it would be a trivial matter for the network to choose to reject the data, it was not unreasonable to suppose that the aloof's sensibilities might differ on this point from her own. Jassim had left Shalouf for a city. Shalouf. Shalouf. I just realized how similar that sounds to aloof. But it's spelled completely differently, so I'm going to pronounce it really weird. Good me. Sorry. Jassim had left Shalouf for a city on the other side of the planet. Layla's feelings about this were mixed. It was always painful when they separated, but the reminder that they were not irrevocably welded together also brought an undeniable sense of space and freedom. She loved him beyond measure, but that was not the final word on every question. She was not certain that she would not relent in the end, and die quietly beside him when the news came through from Massa. There were moments when it seemed utterly perverse, masochistic, and self-aggrandizing to flee from that calm, dignified end for the sake of trying to cap their modest revolution with a new and spectacularly dangerous folly. Nor, though, was she certain that Jasim would not change his own mind and take her hand while they plunged off this cliff together. When the months dragged on with no decision on her request, no news from Massa, and no overtures from her husband, Layla became an orator, traveling from city to city, promoting her scheme to blaze a trail through the heart of the bulge. Her words and image were conveyed into virtual fora, but her physical presence was a way to draw attention to her cause, and listening party pilgrims and Tasefi alike packed the meeting places when she came. She mastered the locals' language and style, but left it inflected with some suitably alien mannerisms. The fact that a rumor had arisen that she was one of the first eavesdroppers did no harm to her attendance figures. When she reached the city of Jasim's self-imposed exile, she searched the audience for him in vain. As she walked out into the night, a sense of panic gripped her. She felt no fear for herself, but the thought of him dying here alone was unbearable. She sat in the street, weeping. How had it come to this? They had been prepared for a glorious failure, prepared to be broken by the aloof's unyielding silence, and instead the fruits of their labor had swept through the disk, reinvigorating 1,000 cultures. How could the taste of success be so bitter? Layla imagined calling out to Jasim, finding him, holding him again, repairing their wounds. A splinter of steel remained inside her, though. She looked up into the blazing sky. The aloof were there, waiting, daring her to stand before them. To come this far, then step back from the edge for the comfort of a familiar embrace would diminish her. I don't know why I'm having a hard time saying that. The aloof were there, waiting, daring her to stand before them. To come this far, then step back from the edge. Wow. Okay, that's what's throwing me. It's a line break at a weird spot, and for some reason, the interplay of from the edge for the comfort is really messing with my head. I don't know why. To come this far, then step back from the edge for the comfort of a familiar embrace would diminish her. She would not retreat. The news arrived from Massa. 40,000 years before, the spillage from the far side of the bulge had been caught in time. Vast swaths of the data matched the observations that Tassif had been holding in anticipation of this moment for the last 15,000 years. There was more. Reports of other correlations from other observatories followed within minutes. As the message from Massa had been relayed around the inner disk, a cascade of similar matches with other stores of data had been found. By seeing where packets dropped out of the stream, their abstract addresses became concrete, physical locations within the bulge. There we go. Sorry. As Layla stood in Shalof's main square in the dark, absorbing the reports, the Aloof's network was growing more solid, less ethereal by the minute. The streets around her were erupting with signs of elation. Polyglot shouts, chirps and buzzes, celebratory scents and vivid pigmentation changes. Bursts of luminescence spread across the square. Even the relentlessly sober heptapods had abandoned their food carts to lie on their backs, spinning with delight. Layla wheeled around, drinking it in, commanding her translator to punch the meaning of every disparate gesture and sound deep into her brain, unifying the kaleidoscope into a single emotional charge. The stars of the bulge came out. Tassif offered an overlay for everyone to share, with the newly mapped routes shining like golden highways. From all around her, Layla picked up the signals of those who were joining the view. People of every civilization, every species, every replicator were seeing the Aloof's secret roads painted across the sky. Layla walked through the streets of Shalof, feeling Jasim's absence sharply, but too familiar with that pain to be overcome by it. If the joy of this moment was muted, every celebration would be blighted in the same way now. She could not expect anything else. She would grow inured to it. Tassif spoke to her.
The citizens have reached a decision. They will grant your request. I'm grateful. There is a condition. The transmitter must be built at least 20 light-years away, either in interstellar space or in the circumstellar region of an uninhabited system. I understand.
This way, in the event that the aloof felt threatened to the point of provoking destructive retribution, Tassif would survive an act of violence, at least on a stellar scale, directed against the transmitter itself.
We advise you to prepare your final plans for the hardware and submit them when you're sure they will fulfill your purpose. Of course.
Layla went back to her room and reviewed the plans she had already drafted. She had anticipated the Tasefi wanting a considerable safety margin, so she had worked out the energy budgets for detailed scenarios involving engineering spores and 47 different cometary clouds that fell within Tassif's jurisdiction. It took just seconds to identify the best one that met the required conditions, and she lodged it without hesitation. Out on the streets, the listening party continued. For the billion pilgrims, this was enough. They would go home, return to their grandchildren, and die happy in the knowledge that they had finally seen something new in the world. Layla envied them. There'd been a time when that would have been enough for her, too. She left her room and rejoined the celebration, talking, laughing, dancing with strangers, letting herself grow giddy with the moment. When the sun came up, she made her way home, stepping lightly over the sleeping bodies that filled the street. The engineering spores were the latest generation, strong bullets launched at close to light speed that shed their momentum by diving through the heart of a star, and then rebuilding themselves at atomic density as they decayed in the stellar atmosphere. In effect, the dying femto machines constructed nanomachines bearing the same blueprints as they'd carried within themselves at nuclear densities, which then continued out to the cometary cloud to replicate and commence the real work of mining raw materials and building the gamma-ray transmitter. Layla contemplated following in their wake, sending herself as a signal to be picked up by the as-yet unbuilt transmitter. It would not have been as big a gamble as Jasim's with Trident. The strong bullets had already been used successfully this way in hundreds of similar stars. In the end, she chose to wait on Tassif for a signal that the transmitter had been successfully constructed, and had tested, aligned, and calibrated itself. If she was going to march blindly into the bulge, it would be absurd to stumble and fall prematurely before she even reached the precipice. When the day came, some 10,000 people gathered in the center of Shalof to bid the traveler a safe journey. Layla would have preferred to slip away quietly, but after all her lobbying she had surrendered her privacy, and the Tasefi seemed to feel that she owed them this last splash of color and ceremony. 46 years after the listening party, most of the pilgrims had returned to their homes, but of the few hundred who had lingered in Shalof, nearly all had showed up for this curious footnote to the main event. Layla wasn't sure that anyone here believed the Aloof's network would do more than bounce her straight back into the disk, but the affection these well-wishers expressed seemed genuine. Someone had even gone to the trouble of digging up a phrase in the oldest known surviving language of her ancestral species. Safar Bekir, may your journey be blessed. They had written it across the sky in an ancient script that she'd last seen 80,000 years before, and it had been spread among the crowd phonetically so that everyone she met could offer her this hopeful farewell as she passed. Tassif, the insentient delegate of all the planet's Tassif, the insentient delegate of all the planet's citizens, addressed the crowd with some somber ceremonial blather. Layla's mind wandered, settling on the observation that she was probably partaking in a public execution. No matter. She had said goodbye to her friends and family long ago. When she stepped through the ceremonial gate, which had been smeared with a tarry mess that the Tasefi considered the height of beauty, she would close her eyes and recall her last night on Najib, letting the intervening millennia collapse into a dream. Everyone chose death in the end, and no one's exit was perfect. Better to rely on your own flawed judgments, better to make your own ungainly mess of it, than live in the days when nature would simply take you at random. As Tassif fell silent, a familiar voice rose up from the crowd. "Are you still resolved to do this foolish thing?" Layla glared down at her husband. "Yes, I am." "You won't reconsider?" "No." "Then I'm coming with you." Jassim pushed his way through the startled audience and climbed onto the stage. Layla spoke to him privately. "You're embarrassing us both." He replied in the same way. "Don't be petty. I know I've hurt you, but the blame lies with both of us."
"Why are you doing this? You've made your own wishes very plain."
"Do you think I can watch you walk into danger and not walk beside you?"
"You were ready to die if Trident failed. You were ready to leave me behind then."
"Once I spoke my mind on that, you gave me no choice. You insisted."
He took her hand.
"You know I only stayed away from you all this time because I hoped it would dissuade you. I failed. So now I'm here."
Layla's heart softened. "You're serious? You'll come with me?"
Jassim said, "Whatever they do to you, let them do it to us both." Layla had no argument to make against this, no residue of anger, no false solicitousness. She had always wanted him beside her at the end, and she would not refuse him now. She spoke to Tassif. "One more passenger. Is that acceptable?" The energy budget allowed for 1,000 years of test transmissions to follow in her wake. Jassim would just be a minor blip of extra data.
It's acceptable.
Tassif proceeded to explain the change to the assembled crowd, and to the onlookers scattered across the planet. Jassim said, "We'll interweave the data from both of us into a single packet. I don't want to end up at Massa and find they've sent you to Janome by mistake."
"All right."
Layla arranged the necessary changes. None of the eavesdroppers yet knew that they were coming, and no Whoops. None of the eavesdroppers yet knew that they were coming, and no message sent the long way could warn them in time. But the data they sent into the bulge would be prefaced by instructions that anyone in the amalgam would find clear and unambiguous, asking that their descriptions only be embodied if they were picked up at Massa. If they were found in other spillage along the way, they didn't want to be embodied multiple times. And if they did not emerge at Massa at all, so be it. Tassif's second speech came to an end. Layla looked down at the crowd one last time, and let her irritation with the whole bombastic ceremony dissipate into amusement. If she had been among the sane, she might easily have turned up herself to watch a couple of ancient fools try to step onto the imaginary road in the sky, and wish them Safar Bekhair. She squeezed Jassim's hand, and then they walked toward the gate. 9. Layla's fingers came together, her hand empty. She felt as if she was falling, but nothing in sight appeared to be moving. Then again, all she could see was a distant backdrop, its scale and proximity impossible to judge. Thousands of fierce blue stars against the blackness of space. She looked around for Jassim, but she was utterly alone. She could see no vehicle or other machine that might have disgorged her into this emptiness. There was not even a planet below her, or a single brightest star to which she might be bound. Absurdly, she was breathing. Every other cue told her that she was drifting through vacuum, probably through interstellar space. Her lungs kept filling and emptying, though. The air and her skin felt neither hot nor cold. Someone or something had embodied her, or was running her as software. She was not on Massa, she was sure of that. She had never visited that world, but nowhere in the amalgam would a guest be treated like this. Not even one who arrived unannounced in data spilling out from the bulge. Layla said, "Are you listening to me? Do you understand me?" She could hear her own voice, flat and without resonance. The acoustics made perfect sense in a vast, empty, windless place, if not an airless one. Anywhere in the amalgam, you knew whether you were embodied or not. It was the nature of all bodies, real or virtual, that declarative knowledge of every detail was there for the asking. Here, when Layla tried to summon the same information, her mind remained blank. It was like the strange absence she'd felt on Trident, when she'd been cut off from the repositories of civilization, but here the amputation had reached all the way inside her. She inhaled deeply, but there was no noticeable scent at all, not even the whiff of her own body odor that she would have expected, whether she was wearing her ancestral phenotype or any of the forms of ersatz flesh that she adopted when the environment demanded it. She pinched the skin of her forearm. It felt more like her original skin than any of the substitutes she'd ever worn. They might have fashioned this body out of something both remarkably lifelike and chemically inert, and placed her in a vast, transparent container of air, but she was beginning to pick up a strong stench of ersatz physics. Air and skin alike, she suspected, were made of bits, not atoms. So where was Jassim? Were they running him, too, in a separate scape? She called out his name, trying not to make the exploratory cry sound plaintive. She understood all too well now why he'd tried so hard to keep her from this place, and why he'd been unable to face staying behind. The thought that the aloof might be doing something unspeakable to his defenseless consciousness, in some place she couldn't hope to reach or see, was like a white-hot blade pressed to her heart. All she could do was try to shut off the panic and talk down the possibility. "All right, he's alone here, but so am I, and it's not that bad." She would put her faith in symmetry. If they had not abused her, why would they have harmed Jassim? She forced herself to be calm. The aloof had taken the trouble to grant her consciousness, but she couldn't expect the level of amenity she was accustomed to. For a start, it would be perfectly reasonable if her hosts were unable or unwilling to plug her into any data source equivalent to the amalgam's libraries, and perhaps the absence of somatic knowledge was not much different. Rather than deliberately fooling her about her body, maybe they had looked at the relevant data channels and decided that anything they fed into them would be misleading. Understanding her transmitted description well enough to bring her to consciousness was one thing, but it didn't guarantee that they knew how to translate the technical details of their instantiation of her into her own language. And if this ignorance plus honesty excuse was too sanguine to swallow, it wasn't hard to think of the aloof as being pathologically secretive without actually being malicious. If they wanted to keep quiet about the way they'd brought her to life lest it reveal something about themselves, that too was understandable. They need not be doing it for the sake of tormenting her. Layla surveyed the sky around her and felt a jolt of recognition. She'd memorized the positions of the nearest stars to the target node where her transmissions would first be sent, and now a matching pattern stood out against the background in a collection of distinctive constellations. She was being shown the sky from that node. This didn't prove anything about her actual location, but the simplest explanation was that the aloof had instantiated her here rather than sending her on through the network. Sorry. The stars were in the positions she'd predicted for her time of arrival, so if this was the reality, there had been little delay in choosing how to deal with the intruder. No thousand-year-long deliberations, no passing of the news to a distant decision-maker. Either the aloof themselves were present here, or the machinery of the node was so sophisticated that they might as well have been. She could not have been woken by accident. It had to have been a deliberate act. It made her wonder if the aloof had been expecting something like this for millennia. "What now?" she asked. Her hosts remained silent. "Toss me back to Tassif?" The probes with their reversed trajectories bore no record of their experience. Perhaps the aloof wouldn't incorporate these new memories into her description before returning her. She spread her arms imploringly. "If you're going to erase this memory, why not speak to me first? I'm in your hands completely. You can send me to the grave with your secrets. Why wake me at all if you don't want to talk?" In the silence that followed, Layla had no trouble imagining one answer: to study her. It was a mathematical certainty that some questions about her behavior could never be answered simply by examining her static description. The only reliable way to predict what she'd do in any given scenario was to wake her and confront her with it. They might, of course, have chosen to wake her any number of times before, without granting her memories of the previous instantiations. She experienced a moment of sheer existential vertigo. This could be the thousandth, the billionth, in a vast series of experiments, as her captors permuted dozens of variables to catalog her responses. The vertigo passed. Anything was possible, but she preferred to entertain more pleasant hypotheses. "I came here to talk," she said. "I understand that you don't want us sending in machinery, but there must be something we can discuss, something we can learn from each other. In the disk, every time two spacefaring civilizations met, they found they had something in common, some mutual interests, some mutual benefits." At the sound of her own earnest speech dissipating into the virtual air around her, Layla started laughing. The arguments she'd been putting for centuries to Jassim, to her friends on Najib, to the snakes on Nazdik, seemed ridiculous now, embarrassing. How could she face the aloof and claim that she had anything to offer them that they had not considered and rejected hundreds of thousands of years before? The amalgam had never tried to keep its nature hidden. The aloof would have watched them, studied them from afar, and consciously chosen isolation. To come here and list the advantages of contact as if they'd never crossed her hosts' minds was simply insulting. Layla fell silent. If she had lost faith in her role as cultural envoy, at least she'd proved to her own satisfaction that there was something in here smarter than the slingshot fence the probes had encountered. The aloof had not embraced her, but the whole endeavor had not been in vain. To wake in the bulge, even to silence, was far more than she'd ever had the right to hope for. She said, "Please, just bring me my husband now, then we'll leave you in peace." This entreaty was met in the same way as all the others. Layla resisted speculating again about experimental variables. She did not believe that a million-year-old civilization was interested in testing her tolerance to isolation, robbing her of her companion and seeing how long she took to attempt suicide. The aloof did not take orders from her. Fine. If she was neither an experimental subject to be robbed of her sanity, nor a valued guest whose every wish was granted, there had to be some other relationship between them that she had yet to fathom. She had to be conscious for a reason. She searched the sky for a hint of the node itself, or any other feature she might have missed, but she might as well have been living inside a star map, albeit one shorn of the usual annotations. The Milky Way, the plane of stars that bisected the sky, was hidden by the thicker clouds of gas and dust here, but Layla had her bearings. She knew which way led deeper into the bulge, and which way led back out to the disk. She contemplated Tassif's distant sun with mixed emotions, as a sailor might look back on the last sight of land. As the yearning for that familiar place welled up, a cylinder of violet light appeared around her, encircling the direction of her gaze. For the first time, Layla felt her weightlessness interrupted. A gentle acceleration was carrying her forward along the imaginary beam.
No, wait!
She closed her eyes and curled into a ball. The acceleration halted, and when she opened her eyes, the tunnel of light was gone. She let herself float limply, paying no attention to anything in the sky, waiting to see what happened if she kept her mind free of any desire for travel. After an hour like this, the phenomenon had not recurred. Layla turned her gaze in the opposite direction, into the bulge. She cleared her mind of all timidity and nostalgia, and imagined the thrill of rushing deeper into this violent, spectacular, alien territory. At first there was no response from the scape, but then she focused her attention sharply in the direction of a second node, the one she'd hoped her transmission would be forwarded to from the first, on its way through the galactic core. The same violet light, the same motion. This time, Layla waited a few heartbeats longer before she broke the spell. Unless this was some pointlessly sadistic game, the Aloof were offering her a clear choice. She could return to Tassif, return to the amalgam. She could announce that she'd put a toe in these mysterious waters and lived to tell the tale. Or she could dive into the bulge, as deep as she'd ever imagined, and see where the network took her.
No promises? She asked. No guarantee I'll come out the other side? No intimations of contact to tempt me further?
She was thinking aloud. She did not expect answers. Her hosts, she was beginning to conclude, viewed strangers through the prism of a strong but very sharply delineated sense of obligation. They sent back the insentient probes to their owners, scrupulously intact. They had woken this intruder to give her the choice. Did she really want to go where her transmission suggested, or had she wandered in here like a lost child who just needed to find the way home? They would do her no harm, and send her on no journey without her consent, but those were the limits of their duty of care. They did not owe her any account of themselves. She would get no greeting, no hospitality, no conversation.
What about Jasim? Will you give me a chance to consult with him?
She waited, picturing his face, willing his presence, hoping they might read her mind if her words were beyond them. If they could decode a yearning toward a point in the sky, surely this wish for companionship was not too difficult to comprehend. She tried variations, dwelling on the abstract structure of their intertwined data in the transmission, hoping this might clarify the object of her desire if his physical appearance meant nothing to them. She remained alone. The stars that surrounded her spelled out the only choices on offer. If she wanted to be with Jasim once more before she died, she had to make the same decision as he did. Symmetry demanded that he faced the same dilemma.
How would he be thinking?
He might be tempted to retreat back to the safety of Tassif, but he'd reconciled with her in Shaloth for the sole purpose of following. Page break. But he'd reconciled with her in Shaloth for the sole purpose of following her into danger. He would understand that she'd want to go deeper, would want to push all the way through to Massa, opening up the shortcut through the core, proving it safe for future travelers. Would he understand, too, that she'd feel a pang of guilt at this presumptuous line of thought, and that she'd contemplate making a sacrifice of her own? He had braved the unknown for her, and they had reaped the reward already. They had come closer to the aloof than anyone in history. Why couldn't that be enough? For all Layla knew, her hosts might not even wake her again before Massa. What would she be giving up if she turned back now? More to the point, what would Jassim expect of her? That she'd march on relentlessly, following her obsession to the end, or that she'd put her love for him first? The possibilities multiplied in an infinite regress. They knew each other as well as two people could, but they didn't carry each other's minds inside them. Layla drifted through the limbo of stars, wondering if Jassim had already made his decision. Having seen that the aloof were not the torturers he'd feared, had he already set out for Tassif, satisfied that she faced no real peril at their hands? Or had he reasoned that their experience at this single node meant nothing? This was not the amalgam. The culture could be 1,000 times more fractured. This cycle of guesses and doubts led nowhere. If she tried to pursue it to the end, she'd be paralyzed. There were no guarantees. She could only choose the least worst case. If she returned to Tassif, only to find that Jassim had gone on alone through the bulge, it would be unbearable. She would have lost him for nothing. If that happened, she could try to follow him, returning to the bulge immediately, but she would already be centuries behind him. If she went on to Massa, and it was Jassim who retreated, at least she'd know that he'd ended up in safety. She'd know, too, that he had not been desperately afraid for her, that the aloof's benign indifference at this first node had been enough to persuade him that they'd do her no harm. That was her answer. She had to continue, all the way to Massa, with the hope, but no promise, that Jassim would have thought the same way. The decision made, she lingered in the scape. Not from any second thoughts, but from a reluctance to give up lightly the opportunity she'd fought so hard to attain. She didn't know if any member of the aloof was watching and listening to her, reading her thoughts, examining her desires. Perhaps they were so indifferent and incurious that they delegated everything to insentient software, and merely instructed their machines to babysit her while she made up her mind where she wanted to go. She still had to make one last attempt to reach them, or she would never die in peace. "Maybe you're right," she said. "Maybe you've watched us for the last 1,000,000 years and seen that we have nothing to offer you. Maybe our technology is backward, our philosophy naive, our customs bizarre, our manners appalling. If that's true, though, if we're so far beneath you, you could at least point us in the right direction. Offer us some kind of argument as to why we should change." Silence. Layla said, "All right, forgive my impertinence. I have to tell you honestly, though, that we won't be the last to bother you. The amalgam is full of people who will keep trying to find ways to reach you. This is going to go on for another 1,000,000 years, until we believe that we understand you. If that offends you, don't judge us too harshly. We can't help it. It's who we are." She closed her eyes, trying to assure herself that there was nothing she'd regret having left unsaid. "Thank you for granting us safe passage," she added, if that's what you're offering. "I hope my people can return the favor one day, if there's anywhere you want to go." She opened her eyes and sought out her destination, deeper into the network, on toward the core. Ten. The mountains outside the town of Astrahat started with a gentle slope that promised an easy journey, but gradually grew steeper. Similarly, the vegetation was low and sparse in the foothills, but became steadily thicker and taller the higher up the slope you went. Jasim said, "Enough." He stopped and leaned on his climbing stick. "One more hour?" Layla pleaded. He considered this. "Half an hour resting, then half an hour walking?" "1 hour resting, and then 1 hour walking." He laughed wearily. "All right, one of each." The two of them hacked away at the undergrowth until there was a place to sit. Jasim poured water from the canteen into her hands, and she splashed her face clean. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the unfamiliar wildlife. Under the forest canopy it was almost twilight, and when Layla looked up into the small patch of sky above them, she could see the stars of the bulge, like tiny, pale, translucent beads. At times it felt like a dream, but the experience never really left her. The aloof had woken her at every node, shown her the view, given her a choice. She had seen 1,000 spectacles, from one side of the core to the other. Cannibalistic novas, dazzling clusters of newborn stars, twin white dwarfs on the verge of collision. She had seen the black hole at the galaxy's center, its accretion disk glowing with X-rays, slowly tearing stars apart. It might have been an elaborate lie, a plausible simulation, but every detail accessible from disk-based observatories confirmed what she had witnessed. If anything had been changed, or hidden from her, it must have been small. Perhaps the artifacts of the aloof themselves had been painted out of the view, though Layla thought it was just as likely that the marks they'd left on their territory were so subtle, anyway, that there'd be nothing to conceal. Jasim said sharply, "Where are you?" She lowered her gaze and replied, mildly, "I'm here with you. I'm just remembering." When they'd woken on Massa, surrounded by delirious, cheering eavesdroppers, they'd been asked, "What happened in there? What did you see?" Layla didn't know why she'd kept her mouth shut and turned to her husband before replying, instead of letting every detail come tumbling out immediately. Perhaps she just hadn't known where to begin. For whatever reason, it was Jasim who had answered first. "Nothing. We stepped through the gate on Tassif, and now here we are, on the other side of the bulge." For almost a month she'd flatly refused to believe him. Nothing? You saw nothing? It had to be a lie, a joke. It had to be some kind of revenge. That was not in his nature, and she knew it. Still, she'd clung to that explanation for as long as she could, until it became impossible to believe any longer, and she'd asked for his forgiveness. 6 months later, another traveler had spilled out of the bulge. One of the die-hard listening party pilgrims had followed in their wake and taken the shortcut. Like Jasim, this heptapod had seen nothing, experienced nothing. Layla had struggled to imagine why she might have been singled out. So much for her theory that the aloof felt morally so much for her theory that the aloof felt morally obliged to check that each passenger on their network knew what they were doing, unless they decided that her actions were enough to demonstrate that intruders from the disk, considered generically, were making an informed choice. Could just one sample of a working, conscious version of their neighbors really be enough for them to conclude that they understood everything they needed to know? Could this capriciousness, instead, have been part of a strategy to lure in more visitors, with the enticing possibility that each one might, with luck, witness something far beyond all those who'd preceded them? Or had it been part of a scheme to discourage intruders by clouding the experience with uncertainty? The simplest act of discouragement would have been to discard all unwelcome transmissions, and the most effective incentive would have been to offer a few plain words of welcome. But then, the aloof would not have been the aloof if they'd followed such reasonable dictates. Jasim said, "You know what I think. You wanted to wake so badly, they couldn't refuse you. They could tell I didn't care as much. It was as simple as that."
What about the heptapod? It went in alone. It went in alone. It wasn't just tagging along to watch over someone else.
He shrugged. Maybe it acted on the spur of the moment. They all seem unhealthily keen to me, whatever they're doing. Maybe the aloof could discern its mood more clearly.
Layla said, I don't believe a word of that.
Jassim spread his hands in a gesture of acceptance. I'm sure you could change my mind in 5 minutes if I let you. But if we walked back down this hill and waited for the next traveler... Bleh. But if we walked back down this hill and waited for the next traveler from the bulge, and the next, until the reason some of them received the grand tour and some didn't finally became plain, there would still be another question, and another. Even if I wanted to live for 10,000 years more, I'd rather move on to something else. And in this last hour...
He trailed off. Layla said, I know. You're right. She sat, listening to the strange chirps and buzzes emitted by creatures she knew nothing about. She could have absorbed every recorded fact about them in an instant, but she didn't care. She didn't need to know. Someone else would come after them, to understand the aloof, or advance that great, unruly, frustrating endeavor by the next increment. She and Jassim had made a start. That was enough. What they'd done was more than she could have ever that was more than she ever could have wow. What they'd done was more than she could ever have imagined back on Najib. Now, though, was the time to stop, while they were still themselves, enlarged by the experience, but not disfigured beyond recognition. They finished their water, drinking the last drops. They left the canteen behind. Jassim took her hand, and they climbed together, struggling up the slope, side by side. And that was Riding the Crocodile by Greg Egan. Nice open-ended, ambiguous ending there. They've done what they needed to do. And what they do from there is whatever they do from there. Alrighty, with that, I got a dip. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. I appreciate it. We should be back on course for our regular schedule of Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Come the changeover to 2024, I may be making some changes, but it won't probably affect timing too much. More details on that if I ever have the time or energy to come up with them. If they happen. They probably will. I just don't know when. But with that, yeah. Hopefully everyone enjoyed. If you are listening to this after the fact, I do these regularly, at regular intervals, every Friday, on Free Read Fridays, starting at about 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, or daily time, whatever the transition winds up being at the time of the year that you're tuning in. So if you want, you can catch me live. If not, listen to them after the fact. Fast forward through awkward hiccups and the awkward start where there's like 10 minutes of absolutely nothing as I get my collective act together. Thanks again to absolutely everyone who goes about putting timestamps on those. It saves me the time and effort of going through and doing that. And it helps everyone else who listens. So it's appreciated. Yes, I should do it myself. No, I don't. I'm lazy. Bottom line, there's no excuse. With that, I got a dip. Let's see. Let me look at my schedule. For now, it's mostly weekends that are crowded, so I should be able to keep doing what I'm doing. So, given that there are definitely two more, and I think they're both shorter than that one, I'm going to double check real quick. Let's see. Hot Rock is 10. Hot Rock is almost as long. Actually, it's about the same length. 10, 20, 30, 40.
50, 60. Yeah, it's about the same length, yeah. So that'll be another one, be about the same length. And I think Oceanic, the titular one, is ever so slightly shorter, but not by much. It's about on a par. So they're some pretty, like, these are like novella-sized short stories. These are pretty big. If you shrank the page size down and kept the font size the same, you'd have a decent sized book. Yeah, it's well, that one's about the same too. Yeah, wild. Anyway, that'll do it for me. So that'll be two more streams, which would put us, yeah. So we are on course for starting the Hyperion cantos before the end of the year, barring some tragedy on my end that interrupts my schedule further, which could happen. It's not too late, but we should. It would have to be a couple weeks long, and it'd have to be pretty bad. Um, but yeah, should be set to start that. Who knows how long that's going to take to get through. I hope you don't get sick of Dan Simmons because you're going to be listening to a bunch of Dan Simmons. And it's very, 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 very space opera. And I mean that in the best way possible. Some space opera is a little too much, but mostly I can dig it. It's how derivative are you willing to be? Um, and in the case of Dan Simmons, he's got some pretty original ideas, um, and it's quite fun. I think people will dig it. I know I dig it. Um, so that's the next step. After that, uh, whenever that winds up being, that's going to be months, plural. We will get on to either Destination Void or the Three Body Problem. Destination Void being by Frank, the Man, the Myth, the Legend, Herbert. And then the Three Body Problem being by, and I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of his name, Cixin Liu. Cixinliu, I believe. Yeah. What I may have to do, and I have a couple of his short story collections, is there's a relevant adjunct short story that I haven't read yet, uh, or not, I have not knowingly read yet, that takes place in the same universe and is sort of a prequel to the Three Body Problem. I can't remember the title of it offhand, so I have to go through the list and actually read that ahead of time. But I've got plenty of time to do that, thank goodness. After those two were done, I swear there was something. Those three, sorry. Hyperion, Three Body Problem, and Destination Void. Could have sworn there was something else that somebody had done as a request. I've really got to get some sort of a social thing up, like a Discord channel, something that I'm actually going to read, and can go back and check on. And also so people know like when I'm the ETAs and when I'm going to do things. This is the sort of thing I'm looking at for the start of next year. Is doing stuff like that. Is having like a Discord channel or something. Um, just largely to facilitate people knowing what I'm doing because I'm really bad and unwilling to do most of the social media thing. Discord has its own problems, but it's fairly immediate and fairly easy for me to keep track of things if worst comes to worst. Uh, Also, people can then get in contact with me, which helps. Um, but yeah, also probably around the same time thinking of putting together a Patreon. I don't expect anyone to donate, and I don't demand anyone donate. I will do this regardless, but it'll at least give me a way to keep tabs on what people want read, if they so choose. I mean, if somebody like says in either a comment or whatever, I want you to read this without throwing money my way, I'm obviously still going to do it. But it gives me an easier way to see this is what people want, or a more collected way to see that, rather than me having to go and look through dozens of hundreds of comments on videos to see, oh, did I remember that and didn't write it down? So, discombobulated.
It's because I have other things going on. I'm going to keep coming up with excuses. There we go. Okay, with that, I'm going to run. Thanks again. Stay safe. Stay sane. Happy Turkey Day or Black Friday, I guess. Happy Black Friday. Having done retail for a significant percentage of my life, I can't even say those two words next to each other without feeling a certain degree of vertigo, nausea, disorientation, and anger. But we won't go into that. That way lieth madness. So, we'll just call it good there. Thanks again. Stay safe, stay sane, don't spend too much, and be decent to each other. See y'all later. Bye.